The next session is about how to measure rewilding success. And for that, I would like to give the chair to Raquel Filgueras. She's here, and she's head of Rewilding in Rewilding Europe, and she will now chair the next session.
Thank you, Lisbeth. Thanks very much. And thanks as well to Jens that has just left us. It's been a great overview of the megafauna of rewilding in Europe. So we've been listening the whole day about initiatives that are happening throughout Europe, and it's great action that is happening right now all over the continent. But the question is, how do we know if we're having success? How do we actually measure it? Are we going the right direction or not? Before we start the next session, as we have been doing along the day, we're going to show you a short video of some of our rewilding areas where we are working across Europe. And I hope you enjoy it. And then we can come back to the session. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the short compilation of camera trap pictures that we received very frequently from our rewilding areas. These are from Italy, from Romania, as well as from the Danube Delta. These are wildlife just going about their life, and it's great to see them so naturally in their own environment. Wildlife comeback is one of the many successes that can exist in rewilding, but what else can be there and what else is there? There can be many more. So we have a polling question for you now. This is not this is an open question that you can type in your answer, and then we will look at the different answers that are coming in after the presentation. So the question that we have for you is, when do you find rewilding successful? So give us your thoughts on the app by typing it in, and as soon as we finalize the presentation, we'll come back to those results. Our next speaker is Associate Professor Patrick Jansen at the University of Wageningen here in the Netherlands. And Patrick is a wildlife ecologist, working mostly in forest systems, but coordinating large programs of wildlife camera trapping. This is very close to my heart. We have several of these initiatives happening in our own rewilding areas with camera traps, and I think it's a great initiative that I'm sure that I hope you will have a chance in the future to come across those. But in the meantime, I would like to give the word to Patrick that will tell us more about how to measure success in a rewilding landscape. Patrick?
Thank you, Raquel. Thank you for the introduction and the kind invitation. So first, a little bit about myself. I'm a community ecologist. I study how wildlife communities differ between places and how they respond to disturbances like poaching, habitat fragmentation, those sorts of things. And my favorite tool is the camera trap. Here you see me placing a camera trap in Panama, and this camera will record every animal that passes in front of the sensor that is in it, and then get a record. So if you run such camera traps in many different places, you get a picture of the mammal assemblage, and you can do all sorts of calculations on those. And these camera traps then tell us how animal populations are doing. Now, I also use camera traps to study plant-animal interactions, in particular how animals help plants by dispersing their seeds. So I ask, how does the loss of mammal species, for example by poaching, affect seed dispersal, and how does that ultimately change the species composition of the forest? But frankly, this work is sometimes very depressing, because I notice the degradation in my study system, and that causes feelings of loss. And sometimes people call this ecological grief. So what does make me happy is going to places like this: rough mountains, old forests full of dead trees, dynamic coasts, and abandoned floodplains full of flowers. And what makes me happy about these places is their wildness, the feeling of being exposed to untamed nature. So that is why rewilding, I think, is interesting to many ecologists. It's much more fun to study something positive. Restoration and reintroduction instead of degradation and extirpation. Restoration rather than breakdown. And there is also a big role of wildlife and plant-animal interactions. So what else do you need? So for this talk, I've asked myself the question, how to measure rewilding success, or more neutrally, ecological effects of rewilding, and how to make sure it's effective for conservation. Now, why is that necessary? Don't we have enough beautiful examples and compelling stories, and also very plausible theory? Well, managers and policymakers will have to know that the rewilding brings the conservation effort, the conservation success that they need before they can adopt it. And also, a better understanding is necessary to meet the criticism. So, for example, that there's insufficient knowledge about the possible outcomes. And also, rewilding practitioners may benefit from measuring rewilding success because it helps them to improve their practice of rewilding, make it work better for conservation. And finally, it's also important to science because this is a huge opportunity to develop the field of restoration ecology. This is the biggest kind of experiments that you can do as an ecologist. So for those who missed the previous talks this morning, the ecological goal of rewilding briefly is the idea of conserving biodiversity by restoring natural processes rather than by constant management by humans. And what rewilding aims to restore is ecosystem integrity or ecological integrity. So Frans and Nestor discussed this morning, but I'll briefly explain. It's determined by complexity and resilience. And the three ecological processes that in turn determine these two things are natural disturbances, natural dynamics, dispersal, the connectivity, size of areas, and finally trophic complexity. So basically wildlife. So what then would you need to measure? So it's useful to break down the whole idea, the whole ecological theory of rewilding into steps. And I see at least four. So the first is rewilding actions are undertaken. So exploitation is withdrawn and other forms of human interference are minimized. And at the same time, natural processes are restored, for example, by introducing missing keystone species. Then, as a consequence, the ecosystem integrity is getting restored to some degree. So you see the three ecological processes becoming stronger. And that, in turn, produces habitat or environmental heterogeneity. You see all sorts of variation coming in. like gradients, mosaics, microhabitats, new microhabitats that emerge. And then finally, ultimately, this provides niches to many, many species that in turn may support, again, other species. So biodiversity, species richness, and abundance will grow. So to discuss these four things, I think these are the four things that we should measure in some way. And I'm going to briefly discuss them one by one. So for the first, progress in rewilding action, there is already a system in place. It's called the Rewilding Score. It was also mentioned this morning by Nestor as well as by Frans. And the Rewilding Score basically increases as human inputs and outputs, so human interference are reduced. And it increases as ecological integrity is being restored. So natural disturbances are allowed in, landscape connectivity is increased, the trophic complexity of the network is enriched by introducing missing species, those sorts of things. So here you see a picture also shown by Nestor this morning, where you see these two axes plotted and spanning a space, and the green in the space is the orange to green in the space is basically the rewilding score, and the high rewilding score is green, and you see it in the lower right, and the low rewilding score is in the top left in orange. So the human inputs and outputs are along the vertical axis, and the ecological integrity is along the horizontal axis. Now, for example, there's a few systems plotted in this graph, and you see in the top left intense agriculture. So this is basically the lowest rewilding score that you can have, and then the top in the bottom right you see true wilderness. That obviously has the highest rewilding score you can ever get. Now, rewilding process can then be measured by adding up the different factors contributing to these scores, and that determines how you move from an initial state of a system to a new one. So in the right graph, you see an initial state for a hypothetical system. It's very, very not wild. And you see two different strategies to move it towards a wilder state. And the right strategy, the right one, is performing a little bit better than the left one because it moves the area into a greener space. So that is in place. We know how to measure progress of rewilding. Now we need a method to measure whether this progress also leads to ecological integrity. Now this was already elaborated on as well this morning by Nestor. There are different ways to do so, but this particular one has been applied to rewilding. And again, it considers these three core processes: natural disturbances, dispersal, and trophic complexity. And but what's different is that in this case, it uses these three to construct a 3D space, some sort of pyramid. Here you see the volume of the pyramid in orange here would be a sort of not so high in ecological integrity state. And rewilding would mean that that pyramid shape, that volume is enlarged, it grows in volume all the way to span this entire yellow volume. So the volume determines integrity. Now here is an example of how this metric was used in the real project. It shows the Leipziger Auwald city forest. It's a forest near Leipzig where Nestor works. And in 1990, managers broke the dikes of the river to restore the natural annual floodings of this piece of forest. So what these floodings did is they created dynamics in the system, so increasing stochastic disturbances. They brought up dispersal opportunities to specialized organisms, so dispersal increased. And the flooding introduced additional species, so the food web became larger. So all in all, the volume went from orange to yellow, and it increased, so ecological integrity increased. Now, to show an example of how you would measure one of these components, the wildlife comeback, so the completeness of the food web, I'm going to illustrate the setup using camera traps. And here you see a map of the Panama Canal area in Central America. And the gray is land, the white is water, the green shade is the study area. And the dots are spots that had a camera trap for 1 month per year, every year. And the cameras let us measure the presence and abundance of mammal species. So these includes the larger herbivores, such as deer and tapir, but also predators, such as jaguar. And we can then calculate trends. Are these populations increasing or remaining stable, or are they declining? In this specific case, we have actually been losing the large predators. But in case of rewilding, you would obviously expect those to come back and gain numbers. Well, likewise, arrays of camera traps can be used to compare places. So in this graph, you can see how different mammal assemblages in forests across Panama are compared. And you see 5 intact parks. Those are the green dots, so large tracts of pristine forest. Then to the right, the 4 dots are isolated parks along the Panama Canal. And then the 6 open dots are forest fragments that were not protected in between those parks. And the places close to each other have a similar wildlife community, and the places far apart are very different in their wildlife community. So we see that these 3 different kinds of places group together nicely, so they have similar wildlife communities. And if we superimpose the animal species that drive these differences, we get this. So you see on the that the places that have the intact parks have large predators such as jaguar and puma, large herbivores such as white-lipped peccary and tapir, whereas the isolated parks, they are protected, but they lack the predators. They have lots of the smaller herbivores in abundance. And then the fragments, they have only the small species with a very high reproductive capacity, so the culture followers. So in this case, successful restoration of trophic complexity would mean that assemblages that sit in the top of this graph would move gradually to the lower right of the diagram, and the camera traps would be able to capture this over time. So restoring restoring ecological integrity is then in turn supposed to assume to increase the environmental heterogeneity or habitat heterogeneity. So it's predicted to increase the structural complexity of systems, the mosaics of open and closed habitats, biotic and abiotic gradients, habitat dynamics, microhabitat availability like dung, carcasses, and dead woods. Those are the sorts of things that Jens just talked about. So how to measure this? Well, actually, there's tons and tons of opportunities to measure this in a very advanced way, because methods using airplanes, satellites, drones have increased in capacities by the day. And these are very suitable to measure the structural complexity, the habitat heterogeneity, and the biotic and abiotic gradients. So, for example, LiDAR, laser imaging detection and ranging, gets data that can help you assess the structure of vegetation. And hyperspectral imaging lets you photograph, so that's photographing with numerous color bands, lets you map vegetations and even identify in plants that are large enough to these species. We just have to pick the right tools. It's in place. Now, the fourth and last thing we need to measure is the biological diversity. So for biological diversity, what we need to do is repeated field sampling in many different fixed spots. So the challenge here is that there are numerous different groups of organisms that are expected to respond. But okay, overall we expect local species richness to increase. We expect the total species richness to increase, so across the entire area, not just at points. We expect the local species turnover, so the dynamics to increase. And we expect more of everything, so more biomass, higher abundance. So, but the challenge then is, which species do we pick? Which groups do we pick? Because there are, every species group requires its own census method. So here I show 5. But there are hundreds of different survey methods, and we cannot do them all. So the trick is to pick the most important ones that say something important about rewilding impacts, and then to choose those survey methods that yield the most information per unit effort, like camera trapping, for example. So the values that we then collect with these surveys can then be used to calculate indices of biodiversity. There are many indices of biodiversity, but I'm going to name 2 of them here. And the first is the Living Planet Index, which compares the biodiversity to some reference point in time. So this morning, Lisbeth showed the World Wildlife Fund one, so that is with a reference of 1970. And that index can aggregate species presence and abundance trends across species and locations. So here, for example, you see 2 individual species trends. The top one is otter and the lower one is beaver in the Netherlands. And those can then, along with many other species, be integrated into a compilation index. And you can ask decline or increases, whether they occur for smaller areas like each individual rewilding area, species groups, or even individual species can all be broken down. It would make total sense to tweak this index for the use to monitor rewilding projects. And obviously the start point of the rewilding actions would be the point of reference. Now, a second metric that I wish to highlight to measure biodiversity is the mean species abundance index. So this is the index used by Globiom, a global biodiversity model. And it does a very similar thing, but it explicitly compares biodiversity to a reference site. It would make total sense to also calculate this index for rewilding projects to see whether the rewilding areas are moving towards some certain predefined, pristine state like an ancient ecosystem, or whether they're going to move towards totally novel ecosystems that we've never seen before. And this means that reference sites, so intact, pristine sites, will need to be identified, if any exist at all. So if you put these things together, this is not all. To measure the effect of rewilding, it's also necessary that we take measurements not only before and after the implementation, so one can see the changes. It's also necessary to do exactly the same thing in similar places that do not receive rewilding, so where the land use is not changing. The reasoning is that only in that way we can distinguish rewilding effects from autonomous trends, like changes that just happen autonomously everywhere. So this illustration on this slide, for example, shows how scientists investigate the ecological impacts of logging using such a before-after control impact design. So what they did is compare forests that received a treatment on the left with forests that or control sites that were not logged. And by comparing the 2 trends, they could see what made the difference. So it's not quite rewilding, this example, but I hope that you get the principle from it. Now, an example, there are almost no Baki-style studies of rewilding impacts on biodiversity, but here is one. In the 1990s, the Dutch government started a large program called Space for the River, Ruimte voor de Rivier, in the Rhine River system. And the goal was to increase the capacity of the floodplain to process the water. In many places, agriculture, like you see on the left 2 pictures, was replaced with extra river branches and spontaneous, what they then called nature development. We would now call it rewilding, and you see it on the right. Now, Menno Straatsma and colleagues from Utrecht University and Radboud University reconstructed how biodiversity developed in this river system. So this map shows 179 different sections of the floodplains of the Dutch Rhine Delta. And for each of these sections, the scientists tallied how many of 614 different protected species that are characteristic for floodplains were observed by citizens and professionals. Now, the blue sections showed increases in the number of species over time, and the yellow ones showed decreases. And the question now we ask, of course, is, were the blue sections the one that received the rewilding? And yes, they were. Here I show the average number of species gained on the y-axis, on the vertical axis, for a subset of the organisms for 6 different groups. And the blue lines show the trend in the rewilded sections of the floodplains, and the red lines show the trends in the control areas. And the fat blue points show the significant differences. And all lines start at the same level in 1997 when the project started. So that is the null situation. So what we see is that overall, in this project, the rewilded sections of the river gained protected species over time. Just number of species, nothing about amounts. So returning to the scheme I started with, this may all seem quite logical and even trivial, but getting these numbers is going to be really, really complicated. But the proper monitoring demands lots of quite difficult choices between numerous options which had not yet been worked out for any rewilding project. And it would very much make sense to maybe try building on an existing scheme. So I think a great candidate is the long-term ecological research network, the LTR, in which many of these choices have already been made, and it's already operating across Europe. So let me end with some conclusions. So this is going to be a great opportunity for science, but assessing the rewilding progress and success is going to demand a substantial monitoring effort with repeated surveys over very long time spans, so not something we typically do in a PhD project. We're going to need standards for habitat and biodiversity monitoring because they're not yet there, and perhaps we should use the LTER system. We're going to have before after control impact designs, which means that we do not only need to monitor in the rewilding areas, but also in control areas that were paired to these sites. And we're going to document the null situation, so before rewilding even starts, which is often forgotten. And then finally, we need to select wild reference places for comparison, because then we can really truly measure where the ecosystem integrity, how it compares to original, and we can determine whether the ecosystems that are formed are ancient or are novel. And if all this can happen, we're going to have one of the greatest studies of the world, and we will have lots and lots of happy ecologists. I thank you, and I will take questions.
Thank you, Patrick. Thanks very much for your presentation. This is probably one of the most exciting parts of studying and being out there, understanding what is happening with wildlife. I love to be in the field. Not that I do that much anymore, but there was a time in my life that did happen a lot, and that and I saw the value of camera trapping and these studies for the long term. They do require a lot of investment and time, but they do produce results that are quite valuable from a management point of view. I was not the only one that was quite happy with the presentation. There are a few questions that came in, and I'm going to ask a few that the audience asked, and we'll go over them. So the first one asks, the wilding process is so complex and the results are so profound that we do not need to measure the rewilding index to understand the success of the process. Why do we not just allow nature to take over with few anthropogenic interventions?
Well, that we could. I mean, the manager could decide to do so, but that is then just a choice, and it will also be measured at with this index. It will just be a different alternative trajectory in this system. Mm-hmm. So it is not like disagreeing with this index. The index will just work out differently. Yeah. So it is a choice, and with as few as possible anthropogenic interventions, things might go a little bit more slowly. So the movement towards a high rewilding score will be slower. Mm-hmm. But otherwise, there's no fundamental difference for the measurement, I mean.
Good. Do we... Another question that came in has to do, asks, do we see possibilities for citizen science to attribute to measurements? Do you see inspiring examples of this?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, the example I showed of the Baki study that was done in the Dutch river system, used citizen science as well. So lots of the observations were done by people who just go into these places for leisure, watch birds, look at butterflies, look at dragonflies, and those generated lots of these data. So as long as these rewilding areas are accessible and actually visited by people, citizen science programs in which people record what they see using these modern apps where you make a photograph, so you also have photo evidence of an animal or plant living there, may contribute to at least knowing which species live there. It will not work for abundance, but it will work for the presence of species. So certainly, yes.
Great, thank you. One other question coming from the audience. Is the rewilding score only intended to indicate the rewilding progress of a single rewilding area within its local boundaries over time? Or is this approach also suitable to compare states of different rewilding projects?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I've actually been thinking about what if we just took all the national parks, for example, that we have here in the Netherlands, and we would look where they sit in this space, and how many of them are really green, and how many of them are actually just orange. So yes, I think that score can certainly be used to put all sorts of places in this ranking space. And then see whether whatever management is used, is pushing them towards a more natural state or not.
Yeah, great, thanks. And regarding time, what is a good time frame to make an evaluation of rewilding action? What would you say?
Yeah, so this is pretty tricky because actually, I can say 5 years will not be enough because many of these changes, especially the ones at the very end, those that refer to patterns and biodiversity, will take decades rather than years. So I think 20 years maybe that would be a good time to look at where you would see substantial differences. So this is also the time it took for NEP estate to get to this form. It's the time it took for the river system to get to the form where these measurements really showed substantial differences. It can go faster. It just depends on the state of the system. I suppose that if you stop working arable land and it's very fertile, you will see differences very fast. But if you have an existing natural area and you change the management, it will take longer, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree. I fully agree. I think time is a key aspect of these initiatives that we need to take into account. One more question coming from the audience. For the biodiversity measure, based on which kind of criteria we select the target monitoring species?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. So now that depends, of course, on the goals of your project. So that also determines basically whether you say the project is a success or not. In this case, you would want to capture those species groups that indicate the health of a system. And maybe some kinds of creatures are more suitable for doing that because they're more sensitive, they're more dependent on specific niches, they are more indicative of high connectivity, and those species you would want to preferentially monitor if possible. I think this is typically something that you would try to do with lots of different sciences in a group, and that already happens for the LTER. So I would say just adopt the LTER system where they already made all those choices and add some really interesting sites to this system that is already in place.
Yeah. Good. One more question. I'm wondering if it's for you or for me. What about measuring the social acceptance of rewilding projects? Are all Rewilding Europe pilot sites accompanied by such studies? I'm sure you can answer this one.
No, I can't. That's a question for you. Because I really, so my talk was really about the ecological effects. Sure, the social effects are as important as the ecological one, because otherwise there's no support. You need the support, you need the enthusiasm of the people for these projects to be successful. But I have no clue how to measure it.
Yeah. Now, social sciences is indeed another component of the rewilding matrix. And yes, we are measuring, if I may answer a little bit of the question, what is happening is that we are looking at the success of rewilding from a point of view of enterprise startups and how that is taking shape in the different rewilding areas. We can talk more about that in another time. But there's another question from the audience. For comparisons, plots with intervention and without intervention. This is a setup when the effects versus the greatest situation. How do you look at the results versus what the target is, what you want to achieve?
Let me read that question again.
Yeah, it's not an easy one. For comparisons, plots with intervention and without intervention.
Yeah, when it's about plots, it really you would, for example, so one typical way of doing this is, Jens actually showed an example in his talk when talking about Yellowstone. When you introduce large grazers, and one typical way to look at their impact is, for example, to put an exclosure, so exclude the piece of vegetation where they're not allowed to go, and then you can see what the treated situation changes to the original situation. Not sure this is what the Agatha. It's Agatha. Hi, Agatha. I'm not sure that this is what you meant. Otherwise, if you consider plot as being a site being paired with another site, with one of them gets the treatment that the other one does not. That's actually the principle of the Baki design that I outlined in my talk. So I hope this answers your question, Agatha.
Great. Thank Carla that you know some of the audience. As Rewilding Europe strongly advocates economic development in the pilot areas, do you conduct cost effectiveness and or cost benefit analysis on rewilding implementations in your projects? Or have you seen it being done in other projects if you're not familiar with the ones of Rewilding Europe?
No, that's again something I never do. I don't care about the costs. I care about
I will come back to you on that.
I care about the ecological effectiveness. But of course, there is cost effectiveness to measure. So some things are just really difficult to measure and then very costly because they take a lot of equipment or they take a lot of people power, hours. And those obviously are lesser candidates for large-scale monitoring than things that are done relatively easily or that can be done using volunteers like citizens and still yield good, reliable data. But when it's about cost effectiveness in terms of economy, that is not my game. That is, again, more your game.
I will get you on that one in just a second. But before I get there, there's another question from the audience. The index is super, but the reality is very constrained, is that we have very constrained resources. With limited resources, what measures would you prioritize? Now, an interesting question for you.
Okay, so this is about what I like as measures. Well, so I would for sure run the camera traps, obviously, and I would for sure run the vegetation plots because those are just minimally needed to map this system because those are also the things that are the most visually important. Then I would certainly also use the remote sensing options because those are great. You can apply them not just to the rewilding areas, but basically to the entire European landscape at some point, and it would be great to use that too. Otherwise, very difficult. I would prioritize the ones that are in the LTER because they already made these choices and they have a ranking. And I would follow this ranking because it is the product of the efforts of many scientists that did the thinking, and I would follow them.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned that some of these initiatives take a long time to generate trends and results. But there's an interesting question from the audience on that. Which kind of results in the short term can be shown to, for example, politicians to maintain support for the project, for reintroduction of species and wildlife coming back into the landscapes?
So the things that can be shown on the short term are basically the actions that the managers of the areas take, like reintroducing the species, like for example, changing the course of rivers by moving the boulders. Examples that we saw this morning, those are really great to communicate, and they show action. And I think Rewilding Europe is doing a great job in documenting these things as they happen, and just telling a nice, compelling, and a plausible story with them on what these things are going to mean for the system. I think those things, documenting those actions, the actual rewilding actions, are really sufficient for convincing the politicians about something exciting being happening and something promising happening on the short term. And whenever people want to see more, I think they would need to be taken to places where rewilding has already been happening for like 20 years, and see what they can do. Because in the area itself, it's going to be a little bit slow.
Yeah. Thanks very much. We're not going to be able to continue answering all the questions that are coming in. They keep coming in. We'll have to leave that for after the symposium. But in the meantime, I would like to look at the poll and the poll results that came in. Thank you for all of those that took a little bit of time to give your thoughts. And we're going to just talk a little bit of what people in the audience is calling rewilding success. So the question that we were polling is, when do you find rewilding successful? So let's see, let's grab one answer. So for example, one person has said that when ecosystems become more wild, high ecological integrity, including a lot of things that I just too quick. I'm not sure if this is, you can see these answers, but one person said, I honestly have no idea.
Yeah.
It's a very honest answer. My instinct is to say when humans, animals, and flora are in balance, and that it doesn't take a lot of work. What do you think about this one?
When humans, animals, and flora are in balance and it doesn't take a lot of work. Well, it doesn't take a lot of work is typical for a rewilding area, but it's also typically for an area that nobody cares about. So that would not necessarily be a success. But when they are in balance, yeah, I guess that would apply to a successful rewilding area. But I would find that very, very difficult to measure, I think.
Yeah, dynamic balance.
But this answer by Sarah Betty is similar when nature and humans happily coexist in that particular area. Yeah.
No, it's
again difficult to measure, but I would think that fits a successful rewilding project.
Yeah. Another one, when habitat complexity has increased, biodiversity numbers and species frequency have increased, and no rare species have been lost. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, if the goal of rewilding is to, in a certain area, if that is to conserve biodiversity, then this is what you would call a success. So what you would call a success also depends, of course, on your explicit goals. Mm-hmm. And when it is biodiversity conservation, so not just the restoration of the processes, but really the conservation of biodiversity, then that would be what you call a success. I agree.
Thank you. That has been very good. Thank you very much to all of those that took the time to answer. It's interesting to see the type of understanding that what people call success. But moving on to a little bit of, we have a few questions for you as well. I hope that is okay.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
And they come from the practitioner standpoint, which is who I am, and you are a scientist. So we're going to have a little bit of a chat about money and time. So one of the things that we've noticed being out there is that camera traps are an incredibly attractive method. And people, even nature enthusiasts out there, are just putting cameras out even in their gardens or backyards or forests or many places to see what is coming into their areas. But not all, as you mentioned, they don't have the money and the resources to have network of cameras, of 80 cameras and 100 cameras deployed. So what we see happening in reality is a lot of people putting a few cameras out and collecting these images, which are incredible. What would be your advice to those enthusiasts, and what can people still do with those images that they are collecting?
Okay, yeah, that's a nice question. So one thing that people could do to make their work useful is to put the images that they collect into a system where they are not lost, but where they are retained, archived, and put together with data from others to become a real survey project. So if people are willing to do that, then the next step would be to engage them as volunteers and say, hey, you have 2 cameras, would you be so kind to put them in these 2 different places? And so give people a coordinate and send them out to capture the wildlife with the camera on that particular point. And that actually has been done successfully with people in North America, where volunteers get trained to deploy camera traps in a specific way. They even got cameras, they could borrow cameras, and they just volunteered with their time to put them out in specific places. So if you organize volunteers to do that in rewilding places, you have cheaper monitoring potentially, and you have the engagement of volunteers, citizens at the same time. So there's a very attractive way of working. Thing is that then the time moves from, time spent in the field to place the cameras to time coordinating all these volunteers, but maybe you like that better.
Yeah, absolutely. No, but I think public engagement is critical, and I think there's plenty and immense benefits of citizen science and involving the public in this type of studies. That brings me to the issue of time. Time was an issue that is coming up over and over again, of how to measure rewilding success when a lot of these projects and a lot of this monitoring takes 10 years, 20 years to actually show changes in the landscape and wildlife populations and all that. So considering that we don't have 10 years, there's a biodiversity crisis happening right now, we have to act now. What do you think we can wait for these results? Or can we do something else with best practices or another approach? Because we do not have 10 years or 20 years. How can we go about it?
You need the 10 years. You need, I think, to get stable measurements that are substantially different from the null situation, or depending on what places you start with. Like I said, if you start with an agricultural field on fertile soil, then the differences, the changes will be fast and it will be massive. But if you start out with some land that is already quite natural, it may be much slower. So, but I think there will be groups that respond faster, and then those groups you can show results for sooner. I don't think that needs to hamper conservation efforts. Just we know that sometimes things go slow, and that's not the problem. I mean, as long as if you do the slow things on a large scale, you still make large contributions. And even though that might not be visible in this small 1 square meter plot, it will be visible over large surfaces.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to this interaction between practice and science. How do you think that practice can inform science, science of rewilding? And I guess in the other way around, how can the scientists contribute to a rewilding practice? What would be your views on that?
Yeah, so...
how this relationship works?
Well, the practitioners could contribute to science by following a certain system. Yeah. So not just doing stuff haphazardly and not documenting anything. It needs to be in a certain way tractable and preferably also systematic, because otherwise there are too many factors entangled, and it will be very difficult for scientists to determine what caused what. So documentation and adherence to some sort of, rewilding protocol or rewilding system would help. And how scientists could help the practitioners is by showing them over time what approaches were more successful than others. So informing them about the conservation value of their efforts, and maybe coming up with suggestions for improvements. So in the ideal world, there's a close collaboration,
Yes.
but the return from the scientists will be a little bit slower than probably many managers, practitioners will want.
Yeah. Well, management happens here and now, and I do think that if working together, there's always ways of making it work for everyone. Thank you, Patrick. This is really interesting.
My pleasure.
It's been great to have you here. And I hope you learned as much as we have. If you are a student, please keep an eye on Wageningen University and the work of Patrick and his team. It's incredible work that is happening. It's a great opportunity to get into the field, to see beautiful landscapes. If you are a wildlife ecologist or want to work there, this is the place to go. So thank you, Patrick. And before we continue into the next session, we're going to have a short tea break of about 50 minutes, and then we'll continue with the Rewilding Symposium of linking science and practice. And at that time, Professor Elizabeth Bakker, who has been co-chairing the symposium with me and Frank, she will give us a presentation at that time. So enjoy your tea, and we'll see you again at 3:20. Thank you.